Hello, everyone. I'm Beth Secord. I am your instructor for the semester. I'm sorry that the semester got off to such a rough start. Some things are just out of our control. So hopefully the rest of the class will make up for a slow beginning. So, so far we've been talking about moral theories, ethical theories. They've been pretty abstract. Now we're going to start talking about how to apply these ethical theories to engineering ethics contexts. So what is a moral theory? Moral theories are they're theories that do the best job of explaining what features of the world make right acts right and wrong acts wrong. So a good moral theory is one that does a good job to completely explain what features of the world make those things right and wrong. And then you would test the moral theories by looking at different cases and seeing what sorts of cases these theories can and cannot account for. So you could take whole courses on this. I barely skimmed the surface, talking about three main moral theories: utilitarianism, deontology, and virtue ethics. There are many more and many combinations. We're going to talk about one more, which is kind of a practical one. It's a combination between a social contract and a deontological approach, which I bet that you'll like. We'll talk about that next week. But here we go. So moral theories, there's a lot more to talk about, but we just don't have time. You'd have to take a course in ethics or ethical theory. Okay, so quick review. What is utilitarianism? Utilitarianism, here's some catchphrases. The end justifies the mean. You hear that thrown out in popular culture all the time, and I always sort of cringe because it's sort of right. Like bumper stickers, you know, they're sort of right, but you need to define things carefully in order to be correct. So it really depends on what the ends are, and what the means is. So it's not like any ends is justified by the means. Or I'm sorry, it's not that any sort of means would be justified by the ends. The end would have to be good enough, and the means would have to be much less bad than the end you're trying to achieve. So utilitarianism is basically a balancing act. It's the view that the right actions are determined entirely by the consequences, and that is by good enough consequences. Different types of utilitarianism cash out what good enough means. They cash it out in pleasure, happiness, well-being, preference satisfaction, choosing this state of affairs that would be better than an alternative state of affairs. And it's a balancing act. You want to, here at the bottom, the utilitarian is seeking the most optimific balance, or the best balance, or the most of the optimal balance of a ratio of good to evil for every sentient creature concerned. So when you make a decision, you say, okay, how much pain is involved? How much pleasure? Let's try and get the most optimal ratio for everyone who's going to be touched by this decision. Okay. And again, what makes the act right or wrong is the consequences and nothing else. So here's another: the good of the many outweighs the good of the few. Another catchphrase. And again, you have to be careful to define what these terms mean, but it depends on how bad the things are for the few. So the good of the many may outweigh the good of the few, depending on how good it is for the many and how bad it is for the few. Again, you're looking for the most optimific balance of pleasure to pain. The greatest good for the greatest number. That's another utilitarian slogan. Okay, so quick review of utilitarianism. Next, let's do a quick review of deontology. This is a picture of Immanuel Kant, the founder of this duty-based ethical system. So Kant says that we have certain duties. Kant and modern day deontologists. So we have certain duties. There's certain things that are right and wrong. And sometimes, I have this in parentheses, the consequences are irrelevant. So for Kant, the consequences were always irrelevant. You had to do your duty for the sake of duty, and screw the consequences. You have to do what's right no matter what. Okay, modern day deontologists say, well, we really do need to take consequences into consideration. You can't completely ignore all the consequences. So, so you have certain duties, you know, duties to tell the truth, to treat people fairly, to respect people, to not murder, steal, lie, et cetera, et cetera. Here's another principle in deontological ethics, so these Kant-based ethics, is that people are ends in themselves and deserve respect as individuals who have their own wants and needs. So people are autonomous agents. We have a right to direct our lives the way that we want to without interference, you know, unless the way that we decide to direct our life infringes on the rights of other people. We need to treat others as an ends in themselves with respect. We shouldn't do things to people they wouldn't consent to. Because people are valuable, and they have these this thing that Kant called autonomy. Okay, a catchphrase. Here's Kant's catchphrase. What if everyone did that? So one of Kant's moral rules, besides, you know, treating people with respect and treating them as ends in themselves, is not to make an exception for yourself. So think about the action you're going to do. Littering, for example, you're going to throw your fast food wrappers out your window. And then you have to ask, what if everyone did that? You know, well, would you want to live in the type of world that was covered in fast food wrappers, and then, I guess, you know, with roaches and rats running around eating all the fast food? Would you want to live in filth? If the answer is no, then you should not make an exception for yourself. That's, Kant says, that's irrational, and then that would make that immoral. So, you know, what if everyone decided not to vote? You can't make an exception. If voting is something you value and you're glad that people do it, then you shouldn't make an exception for yourself. Okay, here's another feature of deontology. Consequentialism says there are no things, so utilitarianism and consequentialism, the rightness of the act depends on the consequences, right? And no matter what you have to do to get that most optimistic balance of good to evil, that's what you ought to do. Kant says there are some things that are just plain wrong no matter what the consequences are. And that was featured in the beginning of your reading. I hope that we are on the same page with that reading. I'm crossing my fingers. That began with Elizabeth Anscombe, I think, talking about dropping the bombs on Japan, where no matter what, you know, good consequences you think are going to come about, it's just plain wrong to, you know, boil babies alive or to nuke entire cities. So, so yeah, there are some things that you ought not do, no matter the consequences. So that's a deontological. That's kind of at the core of deontological thought. Finally, virtue ethics. Here's a quick review of virtue ethics. So ethics is just too complicated to be distilled into a list of rules to follow. So a virtue ethicist would say, look, Kant, like, you can come up with all these duties, but there's bound to be exceptions. When and where to apply them, it takes judgment. you know, clearly utilitarianism doesn't always tell us what's intuitively the right thing to do. And ethics is just too complicated to be boiled down to just a list of rules to follow. Let's skip down here. So being ethical isn't just about following the rules, you know, it's about being a certain kind of person that is a virtuous person. And a virtuous person has the wisdom to know when to follow this virtue, when to follow this virtue, when to tell the truth, when to, like, suppose there's a murder at the door. This is an obvious one where you should lie. If there's two conflicting duties, so you've come to my house, you've asked me to hide you, protect me from this murderer. Okay, I said, yes, I make a promise to you, I will protect you. The murderer comes to the door and asks, is your friend hiding in your house? Okay, now you've got a moral dilemma between telling the truth and breaking a promise, or telling the truth, breaking a promise, or lying and keeping a promise, right? So that's an easy one. It's an easy ethical dilemma, that you ought to lie to the murderer at the door, okay? But for more complicated, for more tricky cases, a wise, virtuous person is one that will have cultivated this sort of wisdom and experience and knowledge and character to be able to choose the right thing in that situation, okay, in any ethical dilemma. And because ethics is so complicated, we can't write a list of all these scenarios that might come up ahead of time, and you just need wisdom to apply it. Okay, so this is the, virtue ethics. It's an ancient view, ancient ethical theory. Okay, and then here's another point. So ethics has been focused, you know, since the Enlightenment, on what ought we to do, not who should we be. The ancients thought that it was more important what kind of person we were than what kind of acts we perform. So the person we are is more fundamental to ethics than the acts that we do, right? And then modern ethics is the other way around. So they see the acts we do as the more fundamental part of ethics, and the person we are is less relevant. Virtue ethics say, no, the foundation is your character. So just doing the right thing isn't enough. You must also have the right motives. And this seems intuitively right, you know. Just because you do all the right things, you're a consequentialist and you just choose the right every time, you make the right decisions to benefit the most people, or you follow your duty, you just do your duty, but you don't have the right motives. Like, you don't care about people, you don't want to help people. You're just like a computer executing a program, okay? It just doesn't seem, it seems like there's more to being ethical than just doing the right thing. It also seems that you have to do the right thing for the right reasons. Okay, so you may or may not share that intuition, but that's an intuition that people who ascribe to virtue ethics have. Okay. All right, so let me move my picture. How do we apply this moral theory to the world of engineering? Okay, well, we barely scratched the surface of all the moral theories out there, but that gave you a kind of good idea. So here is the basic structure of moral arguments. Okay, so moral arguments often have, there's a factual claims, there's a moral claim, there may or may not be a conceptual claim in here. So in your reading, they talk about there being a conceptual claim, and then the conclusion. Okay, and the order of these, in all logical arguments, the order doesn't really matter. So it, you know, the conclusion would logically follow despite the order. So you could put, you know, the conceptual claim first, then the more, you could shuffle these up depending on what you're saying. Okay, so here's an example. This is an example not from engineering, but from just regular applied ethics. The social policy of capital punishment prevents future murders. Okay, so this is a factual claim. I'm not saying that it is a fact. I didn't look it up. I just made it up. So a factual claim is a statement that is capable of being true or false. Okay, so this, I'm just throwing this out there. I have no idea if it's true or false. But it is a statement that's capable of being true or false, okay? So here, it's a fact, it's a claim, okay? The social policy capital punishment prevents future murders. 2, we ought to prevent future murders if possible, okay? So this could potentially be a utilitarian moral claim, right? So do that thing which will prevent, and you could make the argument longer, prevent all this misery and suffering and fear in the populace, okay? So you could, on utilitarian grounds, say that we ought to continue this policy of capital punishment for murder, okay? Okay. Then there may be a conceptual claim. In this case, we all know what murder is, and we all know what capital punishment is. So there's not this concept or word that we need to define. I don't know. Maybe, I mean, depending on the context, you might want to say, well, what kind of capital punishment are you talking about? I think we all know, and it's the kind of capital punishment that that certain states have in the United States. Okay. And then the conclusion in a moral argument has some sort of a has some moral content. So there's, we ought to, we ought not, such and such an act is morally permissible or obligatory. Okay. So thus, therefore, we ought to maintain the social policy of capital punishment. Okay, so this is an argument for capital punishment, okay? Now, and I'm just using this as an example, okay? But look at all the parts here. If I were to argue against this argument, I would have to find something wrong with one, 2, or 3 of these premises. Okay, 3 is not really a premise. It's where we would define the term. Let's see if we go here. Okay, so here's the argument again. Okay, so there's 2 ways a person could try and refute this argument. The person could argue against the factual claim, and or, so either or both, a person could argue against the moral claim. Okay, so for example, when I said this, some of you might have just taken a criminal justice class or sociology class and say, well, actually, that's not true. Capital punishment does not prevent future murders. That's not the way it works. And then and then we're arguing about the facts of the case. Okay, our dispute is about the data. So the sociological data, or, you know, you might be looking at data for different countries and just talking about the facts of the case. If a person could say, I disagree with 1, but, right, they might agree with 2, that you ought to prevent future murders if possible, okay? So a person could disagree with this and then agree with that, okay. There's another way a person could argue against this or try and refute this argument. Number 2, the person could argue against the moral claim. So suppose they say, yeah, I agree. I see the data, capital punishment does prevent future murders, but I reject the utilitarian claim. So they would say something like this. So someone would say, I accept 1, but I reject 2. Why? Because Capital punishment is a human rights violation, and even if it does prevent future murders, it is cruel and unusual punishment. It violates human rights. So even if I accept one, I reject two, and therefore the conclusion does not follow. Okay? Or a person could disagree on both of those grounds. So, so do you see, so I think that's kind of interesting, way that moral arguments go forward, and different ways that people can disagree about the moral argument. They can disagree on factual grounds. They can disagree about, you know, the conceptual claim or the definitions of certain words. And then they could disagree with the actual content of the moral claim. Okay. So here's an engineering example. I altered it slightly from your textbook. The textbook used the Ford F-150. I used the example of a Hummer. I don't know anything about cars, except for Hummers are very big and they probably use a lot of gas, maybe even more than Ford F-150s. And they seem not to be as useful and maybe more flashy, unless you're, you know, being shot at in a war zone. Okay, here we go. The Hummer 3 is a large truck that is less fuel efficient than ordinary trucks and SUVs. Premise 1. Premise 2. Large trucks like the Hummer 3, and I'm just throwing out a number, I have no idea what a Hummer 3 is, are less environmentally sustainable than more fuel efficient alternatives. 3, engineers have a moral obligation to promote environmentally friendly and sustainable products and discourage the use of non-environmentally friendly products when there are other alternatives available, all other things being equal. 4, therefore, engineers have a moral obligation to recommend engineering revisions to design and fuel efficiency of the Hummer 3 to promote environmental sustainability. Okay, so this is an example of how we would construct an argument in an engineering context. And again, I don't know. I actually Googled a picture of a Hummer 3 and one came up, so I guess there is such a thing. I was just kind of making this up. I think it's just common sense that Hummers are pretty, they're not very fuel efficient. Okay, so let's go through the parts of this argument. So you've got conceptual terms, and conceptual terms just are words that may not be clearly defined, or they're words that people may misunderstand. So we throw around the word environmentally sustainable. Well, what the heck does that mean? It's used in a lot of different ways. It's used equivocally, I'm sure. So we're going to want a non-equivocal definition of environmental sustainability, or get rid of that word altogether and use something more precise. So the person you're talking with, you're not talking past each other. So I just actually, in my personal life, I just had to do this. I was talking past, it was about medical billing, and we were talking past each other, and I'm like, look, we're using this word out-of-pocket maximum to mean two different things. You're using it this way, and I'm using it this way. So here's definition 1, definition 2. Let's get on the same page of what this word means, what this concept means, so that we are talking about the same thing. Fuel efficiency, yeah. That's also a conceptual term. So what does it even mean for something to be fuel efficient? That's going to be relative to the type of vehicle we're talking about. So I'm sure there's more fuel efficient more fuel efficient airplanes than other airplanes, right? But you don't want to compare an airplane to, your Prius, apples and oranges. So it's going to depend on the type of vehicle. It's going to depend upon you know, what it's used for. It's going to depend on the era that we're in, the level of technology that's available to us. You know, we didn't have the same sort of technology available in the 1950s. So a fuel efficient car in the 50s is going to be different than a fuel efficient car today. Yeah, and then environmental sustainability, I already talked about that. And then also I put in this phrase, all other things being equal. That is a phrase that kind of brackets off the issue. So you could say, well, what about fuel efficiency and safety, right? So you can create a really fuel efficient vehicle that's super unsafe because it doesn't have any doors or windows, or it's just like a little buggy with nothing protecting you. So all other things being equal, when we talk about fuel efficiency, I'm like, well, take, you know, let's bracket off the safety concerns, let's bracket off affordability, things like that. Okay, let's bracket off the technology we don't have yet. Okay, then there's moral claims. So where's the moral claim? So we've got conceptual terms. So what is fuel efficient? What does environmentally sustainable mean? And then we've got the moral claim. So the moral claim is clear here. So I'm asserting that this is what engineers ought to do, that engineers have this duty to protect the environment in ways that are within their power. Okay, and then you might want to flesh that out. What does that mean? I tried to say, promote environmentally friendly and sustainable products and discourage the use of non-environmentally friendly products when there are other alternatives available. So yeah, so going into the meeting, you're an automobile designer and you say, hey, this Hummer 3 is really a gas guzzler. I think that we have the moral obligation to retire this model or do these design, design upgrades to make it more fuel efficient. Okay, that an engineer has that sort of duty. So that's a moral claim, right? That you ought to do that. If you were an automobile engineer, you have a moral obligation to look out for the natural environment in which we all live. So here's the, so that's the moral claim. Then finally we've got the factual claim. The factual claim just is that, and as someone who doesn't know that much about cars, well, it seems like Hummers aren't all that fuel efficient, okay? If you were actually doing a presentation for an automobile company, you'd want to have the numbers there, like how much less fuel efficient are Hummers than competitors, and such. So a lot more detail could be added to this argument, but I'm really just showing you the structure here. Okay, so, and again, you can, this is how you can object to this argument. You can say, that's not true. Hummers are similarly, so a Hummer with the equipment on it gets the same fuel efficiency as a, I don't know, Toyota Land Rover with equipment on it. They both get 15 miles per the gallon. Okay, perhaps that's true. Okay, so you can, I have no idea. You can object to premise one. Premise two, yeah, that would be hard to object to because there's just more fuel efficient alternatives out there, it seems. You don't need to be driving a Hummer. Let's see, number three, yeah, so you might object to this sort of the moral claim. Do engineers really have a duty to the natural world? Someone might say, no, screw the natural world. We are here to conquer, and then Jesus is going to come back in 15 years from now, and the world's going to be over, so we might as well do what we like. So you might object to number 3, that engineers do not have moral obligations to the environment, although in the codes, engineering codes of ethics, there's usually a I should pull that up really fast and show you. Here we are. Okay, so in the Engineering Code of Ethics, I forgot to look at the source. National Society of Professional Engineers. Okay, so according to the National Society of Professional Engineers, there we go. Quote, engineers are encouraged to adhere to the principles of sustainable development. Ooh, look, they even have a footnote on, they define it. That's so good of them. In order to protect the environment for future generations. National Society of Professional Engineers, and then let's look at their footnote. Here we are, sustainable development. This is so satisfying right now. Aha. Sustainable development is the challenge of meeting human needs for natural resources, industrial products, energy, food, transportation, shelter, and effective waste management while conserving and protecting environmental quality and the natural resource base essential for future development. Interesting. I teach environmental ethics as well. So, and I tell all my environmental ethics students that most environmental concern is anthropocentric. So it's all about meeting human needs. And there's nothing about the value of the environment in and of itself. But anyway, that's better than nothing. Okay, so let's reduce the... This is a little bit about how we're going to start applying ethics to specific situations in engineering, okay? Since you are all taking engineering classes, I wish this was an in-person class because I'd be learning so much about the factual claims in engineering arguments, okay? I know all about the moral claims and about the argument structures and what might follow from the factual claims, but yeah. Okay, so that's it for this lecture. I will come back and discuss the rest of this article. It's called A Methodological Toolbox in a different video. All right, farewell.